I'm a software developer, and I work with EDRLab.
And I'm Aferdita Muriqi, and I'm a software developer, and I work for EDRLab as well. And today we were going to be talking to you about reading systems, and particularly the user experience part of it. So what does it mean, user experience? We have on one side bookshelf screen. Probably everyone knows what a bookshelf screen is, but to kind of keyword a few things here, we browse a catalog, discover publications, explore recommendations, search by keywords, sort by criteria, and many more discovery features to actually discover content. Now, once we discover content, we want to read it, and that's where the reader screen comes in. So we navigate content, we read chapters, share annotations, look up dictionaries, find text, and more importantly as well, in mind accessibility too. So there's not just like viewing a page, reading a page, but there's much more to it. So we have these two parts, bookshelf screen and reader screen. We'll get into details into those two later on. Now, with this mission in mind, it has been, this mission has been Readium's mission since 2012 to create building blocks for reading systems, which are open source software and with open standards in mind, like EPUB 2, EPUB 3, and etc. If you want to know more about the Readium Foundation, follow the link on the bottom of this screen. And
All right, so one of the primary deliverables or output from the Readium Foundation is what we call the Readium SDK. So SDK stands for Software Development Kit. It's basically a set of building blocks to create apps, as Aferdita said. To make things in simple terms, on the left-hand side here, we have an EPUB publication packaged. On the right-hand side, we have a smiley face. That's the user experience, the reading experience. And in the middle, we have a bunch of building blocks. For example, one that will load the publication, another that will process data, and a third one that will display the actual content and enable some kind of interactive features with the end user. So the Readium SDK provides building blocks for mobile apps, iOS, Android, for desktop apps, Linux, Windows, and macOS. And it can be summarized as mainly two things: C++ code to enable high-performance EPUB loading and parsing. This is where we handle metadata, obfuscated fonts, we deal with encrypted resources, DRM, and such like. On the other hand, there's also a bunch of code using web technologies, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. That part is mainly responsible for things like pagination, text formatting, typography, multimedia interaction, etc. So Readium 2 is a logical design evolution based on these architectural principles. So again, here on the left-hand side, we have an EPUB publication, and we have a building block that will process that data. On the right-hand side, we have the user experience. So why don't we just look at the left-hand side as a server-side component, and the right-hand side as a client-side component? You know where I'm getting here, right? So server-side, client side. In the middle, we have a cloud shape here symbolizing the web or HTTP communication between these two main entities. Now, you might think that Readium 2 is geared primarily for the web use cases, web apps. It isn't. So let's just rename the left-hand side from server to backend and the right-hand side from client to front-end. And the middle bit, the cloud in the middle, is data communication over HTTP. And an app can actually package those components transparently, and the user obviously is totally oblivious to this. This is just how it works under the hood. So what are the motivations for such a shift in design? Well, since 2012, the technology landscape has evolved. First of all, the software stack, or the set of development tools available to programmers, app creators, has advanced. Publishing standards have changed. notably, we have an ongoing alignment with the Open Web Platform, OWP. As I'm sure many of you know already, the IDPF, the International Digital Publishing Forum, responsible for maintaining the EPUB 2, EPUB 3 specifications, is now integrated as part of the W3C digital publishing activity. As Garth mentioned earlier on, we've got web publications as a future standard for the web, and for digital publishing, it's work in progress. And we have the future of EPUB as EPUB 4, question mark, or packaged web publications, PWP, we don't know, right? So what we know is that there is some kind of convergence here between the web and digital publishing.
Now, with Readium 2, the development model, how does it look like? We have an open source project, which originally started by core contributors with their business needs in mind. We're using modern development tools and workflow for each target platform, like for mobile, iOS, and Android, for desktop, Linux, Windows, and Mac OS, and with their proprietary languages. We share a common roadmap where we prioritize functionality based on demand and available resources. So now, what's important is we aim to foster community of developers, testers, and also early adopters. So now, what does it mean, foster community of developers, testers, and early adopters? We get now to see the R2 readers. So the R2 reader test apps, we have them available on iOS and Android. So those test apps are distributed through the official stores like App Store and Play Store, but only for tests and demos. So but nevertheless, we show a fluid user experience like instant rendering, fast page turns. Accessible user interface is a work in progress. And what else do we have? I mentioned before bookshelf experience. We have minimal bookshelf functionality and basic OPDS feed functionalities. The reader features are minimal features, like we don't necessarily have shared annotations and dictionaries, but to get back to foster a community, that's where the community can jump in into taking this as a test app, testing, seeing it as a test app, rendering the content, and the goal then for that is facilitate the integration of R2 building blocks, because that's what we are creating, the building blocks, into publisher apps, vendor ecosystems, and etc. Now, I'm going to jump into the demo, into the demo of the R2 reader apps. Here on this screen, you'll find the links to the GitHub repositories, where it's not only where you can find the code, but you can also sign up to become a tester. You get test flight invitations, you get to test both iOS and Android, and of course, you can, as a developer, fostering as well the development community, see how you can contribute there. The reader demo. R2 reader demo. I'm going to go to, let's see. I'm going to show the demonstration of the current applications that we have in the store. And I'm showing here the reader screen. As I mentioned earlier, bookshelf screen, reader screen. Showing the reader screen with the several functionalities that a reader screen will have, like browsing through the content, swiping, scrolling through, changing the font size, changing the margins, anything around the content, as well as fonts, etc., alignments, but also being able to go back to the publisher's default. Here we're changing the font itself. We change the scroll mode. We can be paginated or scroll mode. And in the next one, we'll show the different screen modes, like sepia and night mode. And of course, what you just saw in those settings, those are the user settings, but there's so much more user settings behind the scenes that you could be implementing. Here is really just a test case of those. And we'll show here the table of content. A machine generated table of content where you quickly can jump from one chapter to another. Now, I go back here and we talked about the bookshelf screen. This is where the books will be shown, and again, it's a test app. It's very minimal. We show the covers, and we go into the OPDS feature. You can, if you have an OPDS feed, you can add this here, browse through your OPDS catalog, find the publication, download it, and it will show in the bookshelf screen. You'll be able to test your publications because, again, it's a test app, and that's what we want to show and give you even the tools, not just the building blocks, but also a test app so that you can see your content. Now, in the last tab, we show about the R2 reader. You will see, based on which GitHub tag, what code base is being used. So from here, I'll go back here. And that leads us to one of the essential building blocks of R2 in iOS, Android, and also desktop apps, which is Readium CSS. But Readium CSS is not just in the R2 apps. Readium CSS can also be used in any reading system. Now, some of the key features you just saw in the demo, which pagination, custom fonts, color scheme, text alignments, margins, etc. There's so much more features that can be done with CSS, with Readium CSS, and you can learn more about Readium CSS by following the link on the bottom of this screen. And no worries, you don't need to write down all these links because we're going to share the presentation, so you can click on it, don't write it down. Now, we have covered iOS, Android. What happened now with desktop? So Readium CSS, I jumped into Readium CSS based on the demo. Now, the same principle, the same building blocks are used in Readium Desktop. And Readium Desktop is an installable application for Linux, Windows, and Mac OS. Now, currently, the desktop version is in alpha. We have some missing features, and the user interface is not as polished. But the ultimate goal of Readium Desktop is not just a test or demo app. Like, the not is really important here. We're aiming to have a robust, attractive reading system. So whereas iOS and Android, test app, just test it, but desktop is not a test app. No, now, for more information also on Readium, there's also a link on GitHub. All these informations for each of the products, each of the building blocks, each of the test apps, we have them all on the GitHub Readium repositories. And just a quick note here as well. Readium Desktop eventually is a replacement to the deprecated Readium Chrome app. For some of you, Chrome app is rings a bell, and you can ask us later on questions after this presentation about what that means, the replacement. And where are we going here now?
Thank you. So, iOS, Android mobile platforms, desktop platforms. Notice how we didn't really talk about a web reader or a cloud reader. And yet, I showed you in an earlier slide how the Readium 2 architecture, fundamental principles in the architecture, enable that use case very explicitly. So first of all, it's in scope. We are very keen to implement a successor to the existing Readium cloud reader, Readium 1. There's a little bit of work being done on that. It's obviously all open source as all of the other projects, but it's not a super high priority right now with the resources that we have, that EDRLab provides. We focus on iOS, Android, and desktop apps. That being said, So let's have a look back at the Readium 2 web architecture or app architecture. It's the same thing. So on the left-hand side, the back-end, EPUB publication, some building blocks to load and process this data. On the right-hand side, the front end with the user experience, and again, building blocks to enable that user experience. In the middle, either the web or some kind of HTTP communication. Now, the data that is transported back and forth, or rather from the back end to the front end, via HTTP is JSON. So for those of you who don't know, JSON is a fundamental technology on the web. It's the de facto go-to standard for transporting data on the web. It's very lightweight, very efficient. So internally, we call this the Readium Web Publication Manifest. There may be a little bit of confusion here with the W3C standard called Web Publication, so I'll clarify that in a minute. So our Web Publication Manifest, or WebPub Manifest, is an internal data format. It's an optimized interface between the server or the backend, which produces JSON information, and the client, the front end, which consumes it. It effectively enables us to stream publications into smaller chunks, such as individual chapters and, of course, associated resources like images, video, and so forth. Now, I use the term stream loosely here. It's not quite like streaming video, audio, but it's a similar principle. This optimized interface also enables us to leverage standard, conventional web features, such as HTTP caching. So, for example, the first time a chapter loads in the reading view, it will take, a few milliseconds or whatnot. Subsequent times, some of that data will have been cached by the web view or the browser engine that the application ships with. Equally, we have support for prefetching. What that means is that the backend can emit instructions using that JSON WebPub manifest to let the client know that there are resources or assets that are kind of high priority, like the font faces, fonts in your publication, the CSS, that kind of stuff. And that it would be nice if the browser engine, the web view, could prefetch this data so that it's immediately available when it renders to minimize latency, a lag in the perceived user experience. Other things like integrity checking as well and so forth. Basically, conventional web features available in both a web app and a local installable app. So, where does that JSON data comes from? Well, we aggregate it from multiple sources in the EPUB publication, such as the OPF package. I'm sure many of you know that if you unzip an EPUB, you find multiple files, and there is a package file, OPF format. There's a navigation file, NCX. There are encryption-related files that are also XML-based. We aggregate all of that stuff, and we streamline it into our JSON internal data format. This is not limited to EPUB. We also support CBZ for comics, and this is totally extensible. I mean, it's not limited to any particular format. That's the very reason why we want to use an internal pivot data format that abstracts us from concrete distribution formats. So right now we support EPUB 2, EPUB 3. In the future, hypothetically, we will support PWP, EPUB 4 with minimal effort. Now, in addition to serving that data, that JSON data that's basically a conversion from EPUB or from a comic book, we also, optionally, the server can also advertise additional services, such as search, dictionary, so that my client can query word definitions, can search the publication as a whole, etc. There are many other use cases for this. Finally, so I said this is JSON. It's actually JSON LD, which stands for linked data. So it's a bit more robust and semantically meaningful than just regular JSON. And it means that it can be validated. It's useful for search engine optimization as well. So I think that's worth pointing out. Okay, so our internal format is called Readium Web Publication Manifest. So there might be a bit of confusion with W3C web publications, right? So let's go back to basics. The possible definition of a web publication is, well, it's a collection of documents, of HTML files. But we have a linear reading order. We go from chapter 1 to chapter 2, chapter 3, and so forth. We have a table of content, a list of landmarks, like list of figures, things that enable us to access content in random places or arbitrary locations. And of course, we have publication metadata that we all care very much for in the publishing industry. So it is possible that the next generation W3C publishing standard will be using JSON as well, because JSON is part of the web, it's a web technology, to encode all of that information. It is possible, maybe not. At any rate, it's similar to, it probably is going to end up being quite similar to Readium's own internal data format, which will make it really quite straightforward for existing Readium apps to migrate to PWP or web publications. Pretty trivial, because our architecture supports that from the get-go. Right, I have one slide about LCP here. So LCP is supported in all of our target platforms: mobile, iOS, Android, desktop, Linux, Windows, macOS. In a nutshell, LCP deals with encrypted publications using a passphrase-based mechanism. Here we have the usual DRM rights management, print, copy. LCP supports the library lending use cases, renewals, early returns, etc. But very importantly, LCP-protected EPUBs can be read in any LCP-compliant apps. They don't have to be Readium 2 apps or even just Readium apps. Any app can take part in this ecosystem. There will be an LCP presentation after lunch, which we're all looking forward to, including myself. So that's all I'll say about LCP, and I'll hand over to you.
So what are the further goals for Readium 2? So we've named just a few. Basically, one of them, support for audiobooks and comic books, which is pretty much a twofold use case for Readium Web PEP manifest, optimized reading system user experience. Here we go again with the user experience. We have it throughout. It's the most important part. Now, another one which is really important and which Daniel mentioned before, Readium 2 Cloud Reader, which would be the successor of the legacy implementation. But what's even more important is we would like to invite you to get involved. So you can reach us at EDRLab.org, and like I said before, a community, developers, testers, any involvement, any is really welcome. Questions? We're open for questions.
For the lunch? Hello. The reasoning behind you're very clear that you want the mobile apps to be test apps. I think I understand the reason, but what is the reason that you don't want to go into a full-blown mobile app, or do you want to get a beautiful experience but with a limited functionality? Is that right?
The reason for that, is it on? Hello. Mine was better. Well, the reason for that is pretty much the mobile apps already exist in terms of discovering content, and so we would not be able to cover every single detail. And I mean, there's so many other applications and publishers that want their own user experience, and we're focusing on the reader screen. We're giving with the test apps like some sample and test implementations and what could be possible. But with the reading engine behind, can be anything else possible and added into any basically reading system. So that's kind of why not a full-fledged app, one of the reasons mainly.
So we might get to the position where people who are creating beautiful EPUBs have something that they can prove and test that it's fully working, but then still no way to sell them until an app for a store, etc., comes along, right?
Because, well, first, the raison d'être of the Readium Foundation was to create building blocks. So we are not putting that away. We are creating building blocks. Now we are creating with Readium 2 something that is easy to, as easy as possible to implement. So people can take it and create their own, and as many as possible, reading systems. So what we really hope is that we will have a flurry of reading systems all over the world with some customization, new languages. We won't handle all languages in the world. New functionalities, authentication on a bookseller, so many customizations, and all will share the same way to handle EPUB tree. So interoperability will be there because all will use the same Readium CSS, which is the key for interoperability really, or the same parsing, and so, well, EPUB tree should flourish because of that. That's what we hope.
So I understand that the client side is somehow developed in native languages from the different platforms to be efficient and also very quick, but does it implies that it brings to each different platform the level of accessibility of each platform?
That's a very good question. So in this short presentation, we wanted to keep things relatively simple. So we stayed clear of going into too much detail. So our building blocks were very, very coarse. So there was a client side. I think this microphone is it working? Okay. There is a client-side building block that was pretty anonymous on my slides there. Readium CSS is one of the essential building blocks there. So it is cross-platform by definition. It's CSS, but it's crafted in such a way that it will. Oh, that's better. That it will work. That it will work around specific issues with WebKit, Chromium, Edge, Internet Explorer, and so forth. All right, so that's Readium CSS. And then there's the native part. That's a very important point because in Readium 1, this is perhaps something that we haven't nailed down as well as we're doing it now with Readium 2. So we have, I think we did mention in one of our slides that we have coordinated roadmap, so common goals, but platform-specific implementation efforts led by individuals, organizations that have business needs, they have urgent needs to build these apps specifically for iOS, specifically for Android and so forth. And these contributors, these core contributors, care very much about accessibility, and they make sure that they use the latest technologies available on these platforms to provide good screen reader accessibility, support for magnification. And I forgot to mention, in fact, Readium CSS includes techniques to support people who have dyslexia, dyslexic readers. For example, you can change the font and use one that's more suitable for dyslexic users. We, in Readium CSS, we have techniques to handle color contrast, making sure the text and the background show up properly. Word spacing, line spacing, all that stuff is very useful for mainstream readers as well as for people who have accessibility needs. So I hope that answers the question. It's twofold, I suppose. Part of it is cross-platform. The other is very much platform-specific.
And finally, the overall app that will be built with the SDK on each platform will have an offer of accessibility that doesn't depend directly on the SDK, but on the developer who finalized the app.
Yes, there is an avenue for added value in the user experience as a whole, and that includes accessibility. This is not just cool features, it's also making sure the app is really accessible, the best it can be. And we have some of that expertise, but we know that vendors out there also have that expertise, and that's why we need them to come in and help with that.